All right, let's get started.
What's going on in Minnesota right now?
Let me turn off the music real quick. Minnesota. Yep, exactly that. Okay, going back one paragraph. Sometimes it was the militant who would circulate the assumed point of view of the political dictatorate. Because of a silence on this, or the fact which, if prolonged, might prove upsetting and dangerous for the people's unity, and the whole nation would snatch fragments of sentences. This is what they're talking about. Snatch fragments of sentences in the course of a broadcast and attach to them a decisive meaning, perfectly heard, obscured by the incessant jamming, forced to change wavelengths into wavelengths 2 or 3 times in the course of a broadcast. The voice of fighting Algeria could hardly ever be heard from beginning to end. It was choppy, broken voice, from one village to the next, from one shack to the next. The voice of Algiers would recount new things, tell of more and more glorious battles, pictured vividly the collapse of the occupying powers. The enemy lost its density, and at the level of the consciousness of the occupied experienced a series of essential setbacks. Thus, the voice of Algiers, which for months led to the life and the life of a fugitive, which was tracked by the adversary's powerful jamming networks, and whose word was often unaudible, nourished the citizens' faith in the revolution. This voice, whose presence was felt, whose reality was sensed, assumed more and more weight in proportion to the number of jamming waves lengths broadcast by the specialized enemy stations. Sorry.
Sabotage.
What?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were on sabotage.
No. Now I'm okay. Hold on. The length broadcast by specialized enemy stations. It was the power of the enemy sabotage that emphasized the reality and the intensity of the national expression, but its phantom-like character, the radio of the mujahideen, speaking in the name of fighting Algeria, recognized as the spokesman for every Algerian, gave to the combat its maximum of reality. Under these conditions, claiming to have heard the voice of Algeria was in a certain sense distorting the truth, but it was above all the occasion to proclaim one's clandestine participation in the essence of the revolution. It meant making a deliberate choice, though it was not implicit during the first months, between the enemy's congenial lie and the people's own lie, which suddenly acquired a dimension of truth. This voice, often absent, physically unaudible, which each one felt welling up within himself, founded on the interperception of the fatherland, becoming materialized in an irrefutable way. Every Algerian, for his part, broadcast and transmitted the new language. The nature of this voice recalled in more than one way that the revolution present, quote, in the air, in isolated pieces, but not objectively. Let me read what 6 says. Along the same lines should be mentioned the manner in which programs were listed to the Kabalia in groups of scores and sometimes hundreds around the receiver. The peasants listened religiously to the voice of the Arabs. Few understand the literacy Arabic used in these broadcasts, but the faces assumed a look of gravity and the features hardened when the expression from the expression as a quell, which is independence, resounds resounds in the shack. An Arab voice that hammers out the world's independence 4 times in an hour suffices at the level of heightened consciousness to keep alive the faith in victory. Let me go back up. The radio receiver guaranteed this true lie. Every evening from 9 o'clock to midnight, the Algerian would listen. At the end of the evening, not hearing the voice, the listener would sometimes leave the needle on the jammed wavelength, or one that simply produced static. The only announce and would announce that the voice of the combatants was here. For an hour, the room would be filled with the piercing, excruciating din of the jamming. Behind each modulation, each active crackling, the Algerian would imagine not only words, but concrete battles. The war of the sound waves in the Jerbine reenacts for the benefit of the citizens the armed clash of his people and colonialism. As a general rule, it is the voice of Algeria that wins out. The enemy stations, once the broadcast is completed, abandon their work of sabotage. The military music of warring Algeria that includes the broadcasts. The broadcast can then freely fill the lungs and the heads of the faithful. These few brazen notes award 3 hours of daily hope and have played a fundamental role for months in the training and strengthening of the Algerian national consciousness. On the psychopathological level, it is important to mention a few phenomena pertaining to the radio which made their appearance in connection with the War of Liberation. Before 1954, the monograph written in Algerian suffering from hallucinations constantly pointed out the presence in the so-called external action phase of highly aggressive and hostile radio voices. These metallic, cutting, insulting, disagreeable voices all have for the Algerian an accusing, inquisitorial. You don't know, huh? Inquisitorial character. The radio, on the normal level, already apprehended as an instrument of the occupation, as a type of violent invasion on the part of the oppressor, assumes highly alienating meanings in the field of pathological. The radio, in addition to the somewhat irrational magical elements with which it is invested in the majority of the homogeneous society, that is to say, society from which all foreign oppression is absent as a particular valence in Algeria. We have seen that the voice heard is not indifferent, is not neutral. It is the voice of the oppressor, the voice of the enemy. The speech delivered is not received, deciphered, understood, but rejected. The communication is never questioned, but is simply refused, for it is precisely the opening of oneself to the other that is organically included from the colonial situation. Before 1954, in the pathological realm, the radio was an evil object. Oh my gosh, axiogenic and accursed. After 1954, the radio assumed totally new meanings. The phenomenon of the wireless and the receiver set lost their coefficient of hostility, were stripped to their character of extraneousness and became part of the coherent order of the nation in battle. In hallucinatory psychosis, after After 1956, the radio voices became protective, friendly. Insults and accusations disappeared and gave way to words of encouragement. The foreign technique, which had been digested in connection with the national struggle, had become a fighting instrument for the people and a protective organ against anxiety. Let's go down to 7. The appearance of themes of morbid protection, their importance as a technique of self-defense and even of a self-cure in the historic development of mental disease have already been studied in classic psychiatry. Plagued by his accusing voices, the victim of hallucination has no other recourse but to create friendly voices. This mechanism of transformation into its antithesis that we are pointing out has its counterpart in the disintegrating colonial situation. Let's go back up to the text now. Still, on the level of communication, attention must be called to the acquisition of new values by the French language. The French language, language of occupation, a vehicle of the oppressing power, seemed doomed for eternity to judge the Algerian in a pejorative way. Every French expression referring to the Algerian had an humiliating content. Every French speech heard was an order, a threat, or an insult. The contact between the Algerian and the European is defined by these 3 spheres. The broadcasting of French in French of the program of fighting Algeria was to liberate the enemy language from its historic meaning. The same message transmitted in 3 different languages unified the experience and gave it a universal dimension. The French language lost its accursed character, revealing itself to be capable also of transmitting for the benefit of the nation the message of truth that the latter awaited. Paradoxical as it may appear, it was the Algerian Revolution in it is the struggle of the Algerian people that is facilitating the spreading of the French language in the nation. The psychopathology sentences in French lost their automatic character of insult and malediction. When they hear French voices, Algerians suffer from the hallucination, quote words that are less and less aggressive. It is not uncommon at a later stage to note that hallucinations in the language of the occupier assume a friendly character of support, of protection. Let's go down to 8. What is involved here is not the emergence of an ambivalence, but rather a mutation, a radical change of valence, not a back and forth movement, but a dialectical progression. Let's go back up to 8. The occupation authorities have not measured the importance of the new attitude of the Algerian towards the French language. Expressing oneself in French, understanding French was no longer tantamount to treason or to an impoverishing identification with the occupier. Used by the voice of the combatants, conveying in a positive way the message of the revolution. The French language also becomes an instrument of liberation, whereas formerly the psychopathology, any French voice to one in a delirium, expressed rejection, condemnation, and opprobrium. We're gonna look up that word. Never heard of it.
I think it's like approprium, but I've never heard of it either.
Yeah, let's find out what it is. I wish Dooley would show up. That'd be nice. Effects. Okay, so opprobrium. Severe public disgrace, contempt, or reproach resulting from shameful behavior. There we go. Oh my God, why did it do that? There we go. I had to redo it. Sorry, everybody. Okay, back to it. Propium, with the struggle for liberation, we see the initiation of a major process of exercising the French language. The native can almost be said to assume responsibility for the language of the occupier. It was after the Congress of the Soumammen, Soummam, in August 1956 that the French became aware of this phenomenon. It will be remembered that on this occasion, the political and military leaders of the revolution met in the valley of the Soumammen, precisely in the sector of Amarachi, and then commander, the then commander, to lay the doctrinal foundation of the struggle and to set up the National Council of the Algerian Revolution, CNRA. The fact, oh wait, did I miss 9? I missed 9. Hold on a second, I go down to 9, everybody. On the other hand, the voice of Algeria was imagined to be pronouncing death sentences by certain Algerian collaborators suffering from serious fits of depression. These men, who usually belonged to the police services, would be attacked, insulted, convicted by the rebel radio. Likewise, European women as well as European men in outbreaks of anxiety would very clearly hear threats of condemnation in the Arabic language. Such phenomena were practically unknown before 1954. There we go. It was after the Congress of the Soumammen in August 1956 that the French became aware of this phenomenon. It will be remembered that on this occasion, the political and military leaders of the revolution met in the valley of the Soumammen, precisely in the sector of Amarachi, and then Commander 2 laid the doctrine foundation of the struggle and to set up the National Council of the Algerian Revolution, the CNRA. The fact that the discussion were carried on in French suddenly revealed to the occupation force that the traditional general resistant general, I don't know that word. Clip this word too. Be right back. Reticence of the Algerian with regard to using French within the colonial situation might no longer exist. When a decisive confrontation brought the will of the national independence of the people and the dominant power face to face, the French authorities were curiously baffled by this phenomenon. They first saw in it the proof of what they had always claimed, i.e., the incapacity of the Arabic language to handle the operational concept of the modern revolutionary war. But at the same time, the decisions reached in the occupier's linguistic system forced the occupier to realize the relative character of his signs and create confusion and disorder in his defense system. The advocates of the interrogation, for their part, here saw a new opportunity to promote a, quote, French Algeria by making the occupier's language the sole practical means of communication available in the Kabyles, Arabs, Chinois, Mozambites, etc. Mozambites, yeah. This thesis on the level of language went back to the very basis of colonialism. It is the intervention of the foreign nation that puts order into the original anarchy of the colonized country. Under these conditions, the French language, the language of the occupier, was given the role of Lagos, with the ontological implication within Algerian society. In either case, using the French language was at the same time domesticating an attribute of the occupier and proving oneself open to the signs and symbols, in short, to a certain influence of the occupier. The French have not made a sufficiently thorough study of this new behavior of the Algerian with regards to their language. Before 1954, most of the work of the Congress of the Nationalist Party was carried on in Arabic. More precisely, the militants of Kabylia or the Arus, A-U-R-E-S, would learn Arabic in connection with their national activities. Before 1954, speaking Arabic, refusing French as a language and as a means of culture of oppression was a distinct and daily form of differentiation of national existence. Before 1954, the nationalist parties sustained the hope of the militants and the development of political consciousness of the people by singling out and explaining one by one the values of the different configurations and the different characteristics of the occupied nation. The Arabic language was the most effective means that the nation's being had unveiling itself. Let's go down to 10. At the same period, the political directorate decided to destroy the French radio in Algeria. The existence of the national voice led the heads of the movement to contemplate silencing Radio Algiers. Considerable damage was inflicted on the technical facilities by the explosion of time bombs, but the broadcasts were soon resumed. All right, let's go back up. All right. In August 1956, the reality of combat and the confusion of the occupier stripped the Arabic language of its sacred character and the French language of its negative connotations. The new language of the nation would then make itself known through multiple meaningful channels. The radio receiver as a technique of disseminating news, and the French language as the basis for a possible communication became almost simultaneously accepted by the fighting nation. We have seen that with the creation of the Voice of Fighting Algeria, radio sets multiplied to an extraordinary degree. Before 1954, the receiving instrument, the radiophonic technique of long-distance communication of thought was not in Algeria, and mere neutral object was not in Algeria, a mere neutral object, looking upon as a transmission belt of the colonialist power, as a means in the hands of the occupier by which to maintain his stranglehold on the nation. The radio was frowned upon. Before 1954, switching on the radio meant giving asylum to the occupier's word. It meant allowing the colonizer language to filter into the very heart of the house, the last of the supreme bastions of the nation, of the national spirit. Before 1954, a radio in Algeria and an Algerian house was a mark of Europeanization and progress of vulnerability. It was the conscious opening to the influence of the dominator, to his pressure. It was the decision to give voice to the occupier. Having a radio meant accepting being besieged from within by the colonizer. It meant demonstrating that one choose cohabitation within the colonial framework. It meant beyond any doubt surrounding to the occupier. We have mentioned that reasons invoked by the people to explain their renaissance with respect to the radio, the desire to keep intact the traditional forms of sociability and hierarchy of the family was then the main justification. Quote, "We never know what programs we were going to pick up. There's no telling what they're going to say next. Sometimes a religious argument of a permatory nature appears. It's the infidels' radio. We have seen that such rationalizations are arbitrarily created to justify the rejection of the occupier's presence. With the creation of Fighting Algeria, the Algerian was vitally committed to listening to the message, to assimilating it, and soon to act upon it. Buying a radio, getting down on one's knees with one's head against the speaker, is no longer just wanting to get the news concerning the formidable experience and progress in the country. It was bearing the first words of the nation. Since the new Algeria on the march had decided to tell about itself and to make itself heard, the radio had become indispensable. It was the radio that enabled the voice to take root in the village and on the hills. Having a radio seriously meant going to war. By means of the radio, a technique rejected before 1954, the Algerian people decided to relaunch the revolution. Listening on the revolution, the Algerian existed with it, made it exist. The memory of the free radios that came into being during the Second World War underlines the unique quality of the voice of Fighting Algeria. The Polish, Belgium, French people under the German occupation were able through the broadcast transmitted from London to maintain contact with a certain image of their nation. Hope, the spirit of resistance to the oppressor, were then given daily subsistence and kept alive. For example, it will be remembered that listening to the voice of Free France was a mode of national existence, a form of combat. The fervent and well-nigh mystical participation of the French people with the voice of London has been sufficiently commented upon to need no amplification. In France, from 1940 to 1944, listen to the voice of Free France was surely a vital sought for experience. But listening to the radio was not a new phenomenon of behavior. The voice of London had its place in the vast repertory of transmitting stations which already existed for the French before the war. From the global conflict, a preeminent figure emerges through the agency that of occupied France received the message of hope from Free France. In Algeria, things took on a special character. First of all, there was the strip from the instrument is traditional burden of taboos and prohibitions. Progressively, the instrument not only acquired a category of neutrality, but also endowed with the positive coefficient. Accepting the radio technique, buying a receiver set, and participating in the life of the fighting nation, all of these coincided. The frenzy with which the people exhausted the shock of radio sets gives a rather accurate idea of its desire to be involved in the dialogue that began in 1955 between the combatant and the nation. In the colonial society, Radio Algiers was not just one among a number of voices. It was the voice of the occupier. Tuning in Radio Algiers amounted to accepting domination. It amounted to exhibiting one's desire to live on good terms with oppression. It means giving in to the enemy. Switch on the radio meant validating the formulas. This is Algeria, the French radio broadcast. The requiring of the radio handed the colonized over to the enemy's system and prepared for the banishing of hope from his heart. The existence of the voice of Fighting Algiers, on the other hand, profoundly changed the problem. Every Algerian felt himself to be called upon and wanted to become a reverberating element on the vast network of meanings born of the liberating combat. The war, daily events of military or political character were broadly commented on in the news program of the foreign radios. In the foreground, the voice of the Jabels stood out. We have seen that the phantom-like and quickly unaudible character of this voice in no way affected its felt reality and its power. Radio Algerian radio broadcasting lost their sovereignty. Gone were the days when mechanically switching on the radio amounted to its invitation to the enemy. For the Algerian, the radio was a technique becoming transformed. The radio set was no longer directly solely tuned in on the occupier, to the right and to the left of Radio Algiers, broadcasting bands on different and numerous wavelengths. Innumerable stations could be tuned in to amount which it was possible to distinguish the friends, the enemies, the complacents, and the neutrals. Under these conditions, having a receiver was neither making oneself available to the enemy, nor giving him a voice, nor yielding on the point of principle. On the contrary, on the strict level of news, it was showing the desire to keep one's distance, to hear other voices, to take in other prospects. It was in the course of the struggle for liberation, and thanks to the creation of the voice of Algeria, of fighting Algeria, that the Algerian experienced and concretely discovered the existence of voices other than the voice of the dominator, which formerly had been immeasurably amplified because of his own silence. The old monologue of the colonial situation, already shaken by the existence of the struggle, disappeared completely by 1956. The voice of fighting Algeria, and all the voices picked up by the receiver now reveal to the Algerian the tenuous, very relative character. In short, the imposture of the French voice presented until now as the only one. The occupier's voice was stripped of its authority. The nation's speech, the nation's spoken word shaped the world while at the same time renewing it. Before 1954, native society the native society as a whole rejected the radio, turned a deaf ear to the technical development of methods of new dissemination. There was a non-receptive attitude before this import brought in by the occupier. In the colonial situation, the radio did not satisfy any need of the Algerian people. Now we go down to 11. In this connection may be mentioned the attitude of the French authorities in the present day Algeria. As we know, television was introduced into Algeria several years ago. Until recently, a simultaneous bilingual commentary, bilingual commentary accompanied the broadcasts. Some time ago, the Arabic commentary ceased. This fact once again confirmed the aptness of the formula applied by Radio Algiers, Frenchmen speaking to Frenchmen. All right, let's go back up. Where were we at? I saw it. Where'd it go? Where's 10? Where are you at? Oh, it's 11.
11.
Where are you, 11? There it is, found it. On the contrary, the radio was considered, as we have seen, a means used by the enemy to quietly carry on his work of depersonalization of the native. The national struggle and the criterion, the creation of free Radio Algeria, was produced have produced a fundamental change in the people. The radio has appeared in a massive way at once and not in progressive stages. What we have witnessed is a radical transformation of the means of perception, of the very world of perception of Algeria. It is true to say that there never was, with respect to the radio, a pattern of listening habits and of audience reactions. Insofar as mental progress are concerned, the technique of virtually virtually to be invented. The voice of Algeria, created out of nothing, brought the nation to life and endowed every citizen with a new status, telling him so implicitly. After 1957, the French troop in operation formed the habit of confiscating all the radios in the course of a raid, at the same time listening in on the certain number of broadcasts was prohibited. Today, things have progressed. The voice of the fighting Algeria has multiplied from Tunis, from Damascus, from Cairo, from Rabat. Programs are broadcast to the people. The programs are organized by Algerians. The French services no longer try to jam these powerful, numerous broadcasts. The Algerian has the opportunity every day to listen to 5 or 6 different broadcasts in Arabic or in French, by means of which he can follow the victorious development of the revolution step by step. As far as news is concerned, the word of the occupier has been seen to suffer a progressive devaluation. After having imposed the national voice upon that of the dominator, the radio welcomes broadcasts from all the corners of the world. Hold on a second. I'm going to turn off. It's a little cold. Okay. And then we have, hold on. Surprised no one else has come in. Like, where's Doodley and them? Don't know where Doodley and them is. After weeks of solidarity with Algeria, organized by the Chinese people or the resolution of the Congress of African Peoples on the Algerian War, linked the fella to an immense tyranny destroying wave. Hold on, make sure. Yeah. Incorporated under these conditions into the life of the nation, the radio will have an exceptional importance in the country building phase. After the war of disparity between the people and what is intended to speak for them will no longer be possible. The revolutionary instructions on the struggle for liberation must normally be replaced by a revolutionary instruction on the building of the nation. The fruitful use that can be made of the radio can well be imagined. Algeria has enjoyed a unique experience. For several years, the radio will have been, for many, one of the means of saying no to the occupation and of believing in the liberation. The identification of the voice of the revolution with the fundamental truth of the nation has opened limitless horizons. And that's the end of the radio. Well, not the end of the radio. All right, any thoughts? It's just us two. So.
That's fine. Land that I hear.
All right. No thoughts? You have any thoughts or anything?
No, no thoughts. I was eating. I'm sorry.
No worries. Hold on a second. Let me do something real quick. All right, now we're going on to the family. So we talked about women and their engagement. We talked about technology, the use of the radio, and its development. And now we're going to talk about the family, the Algerian family, and its development. All right, here we go. Chapter 3: The Algerian family. We have seen the transformation of the Algerian woman taking place through her revolutionary commitment and her instrumentalization of the veil. It will readily be understood that this radical change could not occur without having profound repercussions on the other components of Algerian family life. The struggle for national liberation and the more and more total character of the repression have inflicted grave traumatisms upon the family group. A father taken into custody in the street in the company of his children, stripped along with them, tortured before their eyes, and sharply experienced brotherhood of men with bare, bruised bodies, bloody shoulders, a husband arrested, dragged away, imprisoned. The women are then left to find ways of keeping the children from starving to death. We shall come back to this special and very important aspect of the Algerian conflict. We should like here to trace the evolution of the Algerian family, its transformation, the great modification it has undergone because of and in the course of the War of Liberation. The most important point of this modification, it seems to us, is that the family, from being homogeneous and virtually monolithic, has broken up into separate elements. Each member of this family has gained an individuality. What it has lost in its belonging to a world of more or less confused values. Individual persons have found themselves facing new choices, new decisions. The customary and highly structured pattern of behavior that were the crystallization of traditional ideas suddenly proved ineffective and were abandoned. Traditions, in fact, is not solely a combination of automatic gestures and archaic beliefs. At the most elementary level, there are values and the need for justification. The father, questioned by the child, explains, comments, legitimizes. It is important to show that the colonized father, at the time of the fight for liberation, gave his children the impression of being undecided, of avoiding the taking of sides, even of adapting an evasive and irresponsible attitude. Such an experience, which is traumatic for a child, when its points of reference are confined to the family circle, now loses its harmfulness. This experience, in fact, was occurring on the national scale and was part and parcel of the great upheaval incidental to the creation of the new world, which was felt throughout the territory. Before 1954, the existence of nationalist parties had already introduced changes into the native private life. The nationalist parties, the parliamentary political action, the spreading of slogans advocating splitting off from France, had already given rise to certain contradictions within the family. These developments invited the inert resistance of the colonized society to turn into action. For the tense immobility of the dominant society, the nationalist parties tried to substitute awareness, movements, creations. The people as a whole agreed with these parties, but they had a sharp memory of the legendary ferocity of the French military and police. Witnesses of the colonial invasion still lived 30 or 40 years ago, had often related to them episodes of the conquest. In many regions of Algeria, the accounts of massacres and the burning of villages were still vividly remembered. The conqueror had settled in such numbers. He had created so many centers of colonization that a certain passivity encouraged by the colonial domination made itself evident and gradually took on a tinge of despair. Before 1954, the son who adopted the nationalist position never did so really against his father's wishes, but his activity as a militant, in any case, never in any respect modified his filial behavior within the framework of the Algerian family. The relations based on the absolute respect due to the father and on the principle that the truth is first of all the unchallengeable property of the elders were not encroached upon. Modesty, shame, the fear of looking at the father, of speaking aloud in his presence, remain intact, even in the case of the nationalist militant. The absence of actual revolutionary actions kept the personality in its customary channels. For a long time, political action in the colonized country is a legal action that is carried on within the parliamentary framework. After a certain period when officials and peaceful channels are exhausted. The militant hardens his position. The political parties passes over to direct action. And the problems that the son faces are problems of life or death for the country. In a parallel way, his attitude towards his father and the other members of his family frees itself of everything that proves unnecessary and detrimental to the revolutionary situation. The person is born assuming his autonomy and becomes the creator of his own values. The old stultifying attachment to the father melts in the son of the revolution. In Algeria, after Satif, and the post-war and the different combats waged by the Nationalist Party during the post-war period, positions sharpened and the people's political maturity markedly progressed. On November 1st, 1954, the revolution reopened all the problems, those of colonialism, but also those of colonized societies. The colonized societies perceived that in order to succeed in the gigantic undertaking unto which it had flung itself in order to defeat colonialism and in order to build the Algerian nation, it would have to make a vast effort of preparations, strain all its joints, renew its blood and its soul. In the course of the multiple episodes of the war, the people came to realize that if they wished to bring a new world to birth, they would have to create a new Algerian society from top to bottom. And in order to fulfill this aspiration, the Algerian must adapt himself at an exceptional pace to this new situation. The truth for once alluded to traditional trustees and place itself within the reach of any seeker. The group, which formerly looked to the father to determine its values, now had to seek these each for himself as circumstances dictated. Every Algerian faced with a new system of values introduced by the revolution is compelled to define himself, to take a position, to choose. First section, the son and the father. So we're going to go, I think we're going after the relationship between the son and the father. At the time when people were called upon to adopt radical forms of struggle, the Algerian family was still highly unstructured. But on the level of national consciousness, the father lagged far behind the son. A new world had come into being, long before which the parents knew nothing about, and which was developing with exceptional rapidity. In a confused way, it was true. The father had caught in passing a few snatches of phrases, a few sharp-edged meanings, but never came to the decision to fight the occupant, weapons in hand. Yet there was not an Algerian who had not faced the challenge of the oppression and wondered what was to be done. Every Algerian, at least at one time in his life, in the course of the meeting of simply a discussion, had wished for the defeat of colonialism. At the market, in a cafe, or a pilgrimage, in the course of the traditional holiday, there always came a moment when the Algerian plotted against the occupier. But these exchanges were like the desperate lamentations of all the humiliated of all the countries in the world. The deep hold taken by colonial society, its frenzy to transform itself into a necessity, the wretchedness on which it was built gave to life that familiar theme of resignation that specialists in underdeveloped countries described under the heading of fatalism. It was in these inauspicious circumstances that the first salvos of November, SALVOS, of November 1954 burst forth. Before the revolution was abruptly split the world in two, the father found himself disarmed and a little anxious. This anxiety was transformed into a confusion in the presence of the son, who would become absorbed and tense. Thus the whole atmosphere was created, tragic, unrevealed, heightened by the ever-present French police, whose vigilance could be sensed, and the whole European city was that pointed its hatred like a gun at the Algerian quarters. Parents ever very often react according to a uniform pattern. The kind of observation that had been made before 1954 reappeared, and the familiar prudent advice was brought out. But this was also accompanied by the defeatist remarks: don't make a move, the French are too strong, you'll never succeed. The son would dodge discussions, avoid answering, would try not to bring out into the open a clash between the new world he was building and the father's universe of infinite waiting and resignation. Sometimes the father would acquire that the son remained quiet, giving up the struggle, coming back to the family and taking care of his own. Bachelors were told that they should think about marriage, and married men were reminded of their duties. Disagreements became overt. The young Algerian had feel called upon to defend his position, to justify his line of behavior before his father. He would firmly condemn and reject the father's counsel of prudence, but he would not reject the ban the father. What he would try to do, on the contrary, would be to convert the family. The militant would replace the son and undertake the indoctrinate the father. Sorry.
To indoctrinate the father, yes.
Yeah. But it would not be to son's words that would convince him. It would be more than anything the dimensions of the people's commitment, the information received as to the repression, the old paternal assurance already shaken would collapse once and for all. The father no longer knew how to keep his balance. He would then discover that the only way to do it was to join his son. It was during this period that the father buried the old values and decided to follow along on the new path. Jacquin Lazaman, in his new book, Viva Castro, finds the same phenomenon in Cuban society during the Castro Revolution. And I'm going to read here. Thanks, Kevin. From as early as we can remember in our country, and this was a matter of profound belief and acceptance, the father owed it to himself to teach, to transmit his experience to his son. That experience senior was the thread that sewed together the members of the same family. In essential matters, the son always shared his father's views. You no doubt know the Cuban proverb, like father, like son. Naturally, I said. Accordingly, the father and the son were as one until the day when a man who had taken refuge in the mountains and who was himself very young took our sons from us. That man was a kind of Christ. I tell you, what is a father compared to Christ? Nothing, senior. So we fathers asked ourselves why our sons had left us. We tried to find in our poor heads the reason for such a separation, and we thought, senior, that our experience of almost 100 years was wrong. It was no good. It was no good, our experience. It was just a life of every day that we passed on somehow without too much thinking about it. From father to son for generations, one single man was sufficient. A man who had nothing to offer but idealism and purity. It was better than our experience, our money, our jobs, our relationship. This conversation of the father, however, did not totally eliminate traditional patterns of behavior. It was difficult for the father to stifle both his desire to reestablish his collapsed sovereignty and his obsession with the frightful consequences of open war, of this open war. Thus, new forms of paternal opposition, veiled manifestation of paternal authority came to light. When, for example, a young Algerian would decide to join the Maquis, the father would no longer formally forbid it. We would appeal rather to the young man's sense of discipline as a militant, and would ask if he were leaving a response to the mobilization call, or if he were doing so on his own initiative. In the latter case, the father would be the first to remind the militant son of the principles of discipline. If your chief needs you, they will call you. Thus, in order to impose an act going into the Marquise, which after 1956 endangered the lives of other members of the family who remained at home, the father had no other resources than to recognize the new values and to invoke other authorities. At no time do we find a really painful clash. The father stood back before the new world and followed in his son's footsteps. It was the young Algerian who swept the family into a vast national liberation movement. Sometimes, however, the situation was more difficult. The father might be notorious collaborationist with the colonialist administration in the very exercise of his profession. This man would find himself concerned into making a irrevocable choice, being a CAD, a police agent, a bachigaha, an official holding office by virtue of a rigged election. That's what that means. He would be both rejected and condemned by the new Algeria that his son embodied. Very often he would reign. However, it might happen that the contamination was such that he was no longer able to free himself from the colonialist embrace. The long succession of compromises was so imposing that there could be no turning back. Several Algerian families have experienced this atrocious tragedies in which the son presents at a meeting that had to decide the fate of his father, who was a traitor to his fatherland, had no other choice but to support the majority and accept the most irrevocable judgments. At other times, the son would be called upon in the committee to set the amount of money that was to be demanded of his parents as their contribution to the revolution. And one can readily imagine the paradox of the situation of the father complaining to his son as he would to an associate about the enormous sum enacted by the leaders. This defeat of the father by the new forces that were emerging could not fail to modify the relationship that had formerly prevailed in Algerian society. That was the son. Any questions? That was his son. Any questions?
No.
All right. Moving on to the father, to the daughter and the father. Next section in the chapter. In the Algerian family, the girl is always one notch behind the boy. As in all societies in which work on the land represents the main source of the means of subsistence, the male, who is the privileged producer, enjoys an almost lordly status. The birth of the boy in the family is greeted with greater enthusiasm than that of a girl. The father sees in him a future working partner, a successor to the family plot, and after his death, a guardian of the mother and the sister. The young girl, without being humiliated or neglected, cannot help being aware of the fuss made over her brother. The girl has no opportunity, all things considered, to develop her personality or to take an initiative. She takes her place in the vast network of domestic traditions of Algerian society. The woman's life in the home, made up of centuries-old customs, allows no innovation. Illiteracy, poverty, and status of an oppressed people maintain and strengthen the specific features of colonized universe to the point of changing their entire nature. The girl adopts automatically the behavior and the values of Algerian feminine society. From her mother, she learns the higher value of the man. The woman in the underdeveloped society, and particularly in Algeria, is always a minor, and a man, brother, uncle, or husband represents, first of all, a guardian. The young girl learns to avoid discussions with the man, not to aggravate the man, quote unquote. The facility with which divorce is obtained in Algerian society imposes upon the woman the weight of an almost obsessional fear of being sent back to her family. The boy, for his part, adopts the father's attitude rather quickly in the family. The young girl avoids appearing before the father. When the woman replaces the girl at the time of puberty, there is a kind of tactic agreement.
Tacit.
A tacit agreement to the effect that the father shall never be alone with his daughter. Everything is organized so as to keep the father in ignorance of the fact that his daughter has reached puberty. The father will say that it does not concern him, but in reality, he wants to put it off. He wants to put off facing the girl's new situation. This necessity that the father feels not to be exposed to the new woman who has come into the home leads the family to contemplate the girl's marriage. Earlier marriage in Algeria is not motivated by the desire to reduce the number of mouths to feed, but quite literally by the wish not to acquire a new woman without status. A child woman in the house. The girl who comes to womanhood must marry and have children. To have a girl who has reached puberty in the house is an extremely difficult problem for the family. The girl at puberty is available for marriage, which explains the rigor with which she is kept in the home, protected and watched over. This also explains, hold on a second, my nose is like, this also explains the ease with which she is married off. Under these conditions, it will readily be understood that a girl wanting to choose her own husband is refusing the man proposed to her by her family would encounter considerable opposition. The girl who senses her parents' anxiety and who experiences the precariousness of her new situation as a child woman looks upon marriage as a liberation, as a deliverance, as achieving finally her balance. The life of an Algerian woman does not develop according to the three periods known in the West: childhood, puberty, and marriage. The Algerian girl knows only two stages: childhood, puberty, and marriage. The girl who reaches puberty in Algeria and does not marry prolongs an abnormal situation. It must never be forgotten that the illiteracy and the unemployment that prevail in the Algerian leave the girl no other solutions. In the dower, the unmarried woman, and the girl becomes a woman at 16, must marry, considered a minor indefinitely. A woman owes it to herself to find a husband as soon as possible, and the father is haunted by the fear of dying and abandoning his daughter without support, and therefore unable to survive. All these restrictions were to be knocked over and challenged by the national liberation struggle. The unveiled Algerian woman who assumed an increasingly important place in revolutionary action, developed her personality, discovered the exalting realm of responsibility. The freedom of the Algerian people from then on became identified with women's liberation, with her entry into history. This woman, who, in the avenues of Algiers, or of Constantine, would carry the grenades or the submachine gun chargers. This woman, who tomorrow would be outraged, violated, tortured, could not put herself back into her former state of mind, and relive her behavior of the past. This woman, who was writing the heroic page of Algerian history, was in so doing bursting the bounds of the narrow world in which she had lived without responsibility, and was at the same time participating in the destruction of colonialism and in the birth of a new woman. The women of Algeria from 1955 began to have models. In Algerian society, stories were told of women who, in every greater number, suffered death and imprisonment in order that an independent Algeria might be born. It was these militant women who constituted the points of reference around which the imagination of the Algerian feminine society was to be stirred to the boiling point. The woman of marriage progressively disappeared and gave way to the woman of action. The young girl was replaced by the militant, the woman by the sister. The female cell of the FLN received mass membership. The impatience of these new recruits was so great that it often endangered the traditions of complete secrecy. The leaders had to restrain the exceptional enthusiasm of the radicalism that are always characteristics of any youth engaged in building a new world. As soon as they were enrolled, these women would ask to be given the most dangerous assignments. Only progressively did the political training that was given them led them away from contemplating the struggle in the explosive form. The Algerian girl learned to contain her impatience and to show unexpected virtues of calm, composure, and firmness. It would happen that a girl would be sought after by the police, or that several members of the group she belonged to would be arrested. The necessity to vanish, to make her getaway, would become urgent. The militant would first leave her family, take refuge with her friends, but soon orders would come from the network leadership to join the nearest maquis. After all the previous shocks, the daughters relinquishing the veil, putting on makeup, going out at all hours, heaven knew where, etc. The parents no longer dare protest. The father himself no longer had any choice. His old fear of dishonor had become altogether absurd in the light of the immense tragedy being experienced by the people. But apart from this, the national authority that had decided that the girl should leave for the Marquise would have no patience with such reticence, on the father's part. Challenging the mortality of a patriot had been ruled out long ago. Moreover, there was an overriding consideration of the combat, hard, tense, implacable. There was no time for loss. So the girl who go up into the Marquise alone with men for months and months, the parents would be without news of a girl of 18 who would sleep in the forest or in the grottos, can't say it, who would roam the Jabaliks dressed as a man with a gun in her hands. The father's attitude towards the girl remained at home or towards any other woman met in the street inevitably underwent a radical change. And the girl who had not gone into the Marquise, who was not actively engaged, became aware of the important role played by women in the revolutionary struggle. The men's words were no longer law. The women were no longer silent. Algerian society in the fight for liberation, in the sacrifices, and in the sacrifices that it was willing to make in order to liberate itself from colonialism, renewed itself and developed new values governing sexual relations. The woman ceased to be a complement for man. She literally forged a new place for herself by her sheer strength. Sometimes the girl would come down from the mountains carrying a new identity card. She would then have a opportunity to tell her father and her mother what prodigious, right? Actions were taking place every,
Yes.
was it prodigious? Yeah, okay. Every day in the Jebel. She would show photographs. She would speak of her chiefs, of her brothers, of the population, the wounded, the French prisoners. She would look at the father. She would sit facing the father, would speak to him and not be embarrassed. And the father would not turn his face away. He would not feel ashamed. On the contrary, he would feel a real joy to seeing her daughter, as seeing his daughter again, at seeing her new personality radiating through the house. He would not be displeased to hear her daughter speak out, and it would absolutely not occur to him to remind her that a woman should be silent. For the 3 days of her leave, the father would feel no need to question his daughter as to her moral behavior in the marquise. This silence would not betray a lack of interest or a resignation with respect to yesterday's demands of virginity. It was rather because the father would gauge the immense step taken by society, and these questions that were still present to his mind revealed themselves to be inappropriate and irrelevant. The Algerian girl who was emerging into the adjutant arena of history was inviting her father to undergo a kind of mutation, to wrench himself free of himself, to ask a woman who was daily risking her life, whether she was serious, became grotesque and absurd. The militant girl, in adopting new patterns of conduct, could not be judged by traditional standards, old values, sterile and infantile. Phobias disappeared. Interesting. Isn't that awesome? Women are needed in the revolution. Hold on a second. Let's see here. Fatima. Can you remember page 116?
Since I'm on it? Yes.
116. Yes. Hold on a second. I think I can make it to 120. Let's do 116 to 120. Okay. The brother. In Algeria, so we just got done with the daughter, and we saw the transformation and the development of the daughter going into revolution. So we just saw that. And we saw the engagement, the example of the engagement of the father seeing their daughter as basically powerful, and yeah, so that's good. Did you want to say something, Joe?
Nope. Sorry. Forgot I thought I was still on mute.
No worries. The brothers. In Algeria, the oldest brother is the father's designated successor. The other members of the family very quickly adopt a respectful and differential attitude towards him. A certain number of things are not done in the eldest brother's presence. One is careful not to be with him in the same group of youngsters where more or less frivolous jokes are likely to be heard. The attitude of the younger brother towards the big brother is comparable to that of the son towards the father. The disruption that we have seen in the relations of father and son is to be found here too. But particularly accentuated brothers may in fact be active in the same cell And then the network is discovered by may join the Marquis. They fight in the same unit, suffer together from hunger and at times from shortage of ammunition. The measure of ritual relations of the post-war period give way to totally new relations. The two brothers are integrated in a specific action and obey a single authority. Let's go down to 2. In the period before the revolution, brothers work in the same plant, would ask the foreman to be assigned to different jobs. In the hospital, 2 brothers who were nurses would go out of their way to be assigned to different wards. All right, back up. Wait, is that 1? No, that was 1, right? That was 2. Okay, go ahead. Okay. The old relationships confined within the closed circuit of the family underwent radical changes. It would even happen that the younger son would be the group leader. The traditional respect for the bigger brother did not inhabit the political or military chief. Invested with the power within the framework of the revolution, the brother was led to go beyond the stereotyped automatic ways of behavior. The man who seemed to disappear behind the brother now came to the fore. The older brother was no longer necessarily right, and each one now defined his own values. The couple. Now we're going into the couple, married couples. The relations of the couple, the relations of wife and husband have likewise become modified in the course of the war liberation. Whereas everyone in the house formerly had well-defined functions, the intensity of the struggle was to impose unanticipated types of behavior. Let us take the case of Mustafa. Mustafa has just come home a little while ago with another feta. He has thrown several grenades into the premise of the judicial police, where patriots were being tortured night and day. He does not feel like talking. He lies down and shuts his eyes. His wife has seen him come in, but has noticed nothing. An hour later, the news floods a district. 2 patriots have successfully carried out the spectacular coup in the alleyway and in the court. The casualties of the adversaries are estimated. The anger patrol that are already pouring into the streets are irrefutable proof that our people have dealt the colonialists a hard blow. The woman comes back into the room and, seeing her husband slumbering, impervious to what has happened, gives vent to her contempt. Quote, "You wouldn't be up to doing a thing like that. It's easier to sleep and eat." End quote. And she goes on to mention a neighbor who has been thrown into prison, another executed by an enemy, and finally the cousin who has sent pictures from the Marquis. Treated as a coward in his wife, Mustafa remains silent, undoubtedly pleased by his wife's healthy anger, and by the success of his assignment. This example, a fairly typical occurrence in 1956, is of considerable interest. In relations between men and Algerian accusing a man of cowardice is an insult for which reparations can be made only in blood. It is not permitted to cast doubts on a man's courage or in his virility. No one can accept that. And when the accuser is a woman, things become absolutely intolerable. The struggle for liberation raised women to such a level of inner renewal that she is even able to call her husband a coward, rather frequently by allusions or implicitly. The Algerian woman would upbraid her husband for his inactivity his refusal to commit himself, his lack of militancy. This was the period when young girls among themselves would vow never to let themselves to be married to a man who did not belong to the FLN. The Algerian woman, in throwing caution to the winds, at the same time divest herself of the instinct to protect her home. Reproaching one's husband for not participating in the combat known to be deadly is a paradoxical kind of behavior, to say the least. But the women no longer consider the man's condition as they did before. The man's job is patriotic activity, and no one can affirm his virility if he is not a part of the fighting nation. Sometimes, however, the woman was not uninformed as to her husband's activity. A militant of long standing, the husband would frequently vanish, and sometimes she would find a revolver under his pillow. As the searches multiplied, the woman demanded of her husband that they keep her informed. She would insist on being given certain names and addresses of militants to warn a case the husband should be arrested. It was on the grounds of effectiveness that she persuaded her husband to allow her to become involved in action. She would invoke, for example, the case of a militant who under torture had given names and thereby caused the destruction of a whole network. And she would warn her husband against wanting to be, quote, the only one in the know, out of the false pride concealing itself behind the mask of secrecy. Little by little, resistance disappeared, and the united militant couple participating in the birth of the nation became the rule in Algeria. Sometimes the husband had been away in the Marquise for several months, would come back on leave, overcome by the enveloping warmth of the home. He would confide to his wife his desires to go back up there. The wife, who had resumed with the intensity that can be imagined her dimensions as a woman, would share with her husband the need to prolong and not interrupt those completely, quote, lived hours that seem to escape time. And as always, in such cases, the frenzy with which every moment was savored, as conditioned by the ever possible eventuality of death that might any day separate them forever. Yet it would be the woman who would ask her husband to banish such an idea from his mind. Quote, what will you say to the people of the village when they ask you questions? Will you promised to come back once independence had been won? You swore to bring back freedom. How can you consider resuming a normal life when all men are up there or in prison? Often the childless woman, witnessing the mass involvement of the nation, seeing the young girl of the village leaving one after another, would decide to join her husband. She would, of course, not see him often, but in periods of relative calm, the couple would come together. It was not unusual for a woman arriving in the Marquise to learn of the death of her husband. Often she would return to the village, to her parents' home. But sometimes the shock would make her decide to stay with the fighters and take part in the struggle for liberation. The woman's appearance in the Marquise would disrupt the husband much less than her militant activity in the centers. The woman who would set out on missions 300 kilometers from her domicile, who would sleep wherever she could among unknown companions, inevitably created a certain number of problems for the husband. They were never formulated, to be sure, but no revolution can, with finality and without repercussions, make a clean sweep of well-nigh distinctive modes of behavior. You can imagine that you can imagine what it's like to hear someone ask for your wife on the telephone. You call your wife, you hand her the receiver, and you hear yourself being invited to leave the room. When your wife goes off and sometimes comes back for hours or for days later, you are given no explanation, but you cannot be unaware of the action in which she's involved. Since you yourself were the one who mobilized her, you yourself were the one who taught her the strict rules of absolute secrecy. The Algerian couple has become considerably more closely knit in the course of the revolution. The sometimes fragile bonds marked by the precarious nature of the present, of what could be rejected from one moment to the next, were strengthened, or at least changed character. What could formerly be defined as mere cohabitation today includes the multiplicity of points of communication. First and foremost is the fact of incurring dangers together, of turning over in the same bed, each on his own side, each with his fragment of a secret. It is also the consciousness of collaborating in the immense work of destroying the world of oppression. The couple is no longer shut in upon itself. It no longer finds its end in itself. It is no longer the result of a natural instinct of perpetuation of the species, nor the institutionalized means of satisfying one's sexuality. The couple becomes the basic cell of the commonwealth, the fertile nucleus of the nation. The Algerian couple, in becoming a link in the revolutionary organization, is transformed into a unit of existence. The mingling of fighting experience within I can't say it. Conjugal, thank you. Life deepens the relationship between husband and wife and cements their union. There is a stimulation of effervescent emergency of the citizen, the patriot, and the modern spouse. The Algerian couple rids itself of its traditional weaknesses at the same time that the solidarity of the people become a part of history. This couple is no longer an accident, but something rediscovered, willed, built. It is, as we can see, the very foundation of the sexual encounter that we are concerned with here. And then, after that, we'll talk about marriage and divorce. Hey, look, it's Doodly!
Alright. Well, that was good. I learned some stuff.
What'd you learn?
I learned that the daughter and the father their relationship changed when she became a revolutionary, and the father was forced to keep up, and how the daughter's life had changed completely from being like in the background to being a dominant force to be reckoned with, and how the brothers had changed. It used to be the older brother was the most important, but sometimes the younger brother in the marquee or in the revolution could end up taking the lead, and that they normally would want to be stationed separate from each other, but in this they were stationed together. And sometimes they're not stationed together. Yeah. And then the father and the son with their
father and the son.
With their growing and differing relationship.
Well, the son is the new society, and the father's the old society. So the son brings on the new society, and the father has to adapt to that, and does, hopefully. You know, I also like the stories of the couple. You know, either they fight together, or they're on separate missions, or one goes off and the other one goes in, and then the woman, when they find out that they're men, might be motivated to join forces and be able to take on the revolutionary progress. So this is all dialectical, and how, because just think of it. we do with our Civil War here, right? How much is that going to affect family and traditions? How much is it going to transform from traditions into something that needs to be advanced to develop the further liberation process? What are things going to look like? What are the differences in the dialectical transformations that happen within that engagement? You know what I mean? Like now, like for instance, there's a little bit of a transformation where we figured out that like nuclear family is not working too well because you would have to be rich to have a nuclear family, right? So like more people are like having more like homes with more people in it because this is the transformation. So these things transform, and the thing is they can never go back because it's too late. They're a new person. They transformed into a new person. The father, the mother, the couple, all of them are being transformed through the revolutionary process. So yeah, pretty cool. Is Dooley still here? Dooley! Are you okay, Dooley? Dooley's probably not by the phone. Dooley just joined again. You're alright, Dooley? I don't know who this is. It's Yemen. Dooley! I know you just got here. Are you okay? Are you doing alright? I was gonna call you.